The night the wheel stopped turning, the air in Charleston stood still. The cotton gin moaned once more, then choked on silence, the kind that doesn't just fall, but settles into a man's bones. Abel stood barefoot on the warped wood floor, the metallic scent of oil and sweat heavy in his lungs. The wheel before him was smeared with something darker than grease, its rhythm broken, its purpose undone. The overseer's voice, once sharp enough to cut through rain, had gone quiet hours ago. Outside, cicadas screamed into the wet night like the world was trying to confess something it didn't understand. He should have felt free. That's what freedom was supposed to taste like, wasn't it? But the blood on the wheel wasn't only the overseer's. It was his, too, in a way. Years of obedience, swallowed anger, the endless hum of machines that tore life apart fiber by fiber, all spinning to this stillness. Abel touched the wheel again, as if to be certain it had truly stopped. The cold iron met his fingers, and for a moment, he thought he could hear the echoes of every voice that had ever been trapped inside its turning. And now there was only him. Abel, the man no one was supposed to remember, standing in the belly of the gin house where mercy had finally run out. Before we go deeper into this story, stay with me until the end, because the final truth behind what Abel did that night is something most people can't bear to hear. The mornings on the plantation never arrived gently. They came like a command, a rough hand shaking you from sleep, the sound of boots grinding against dirt, the bark of a voice you could recognize even through a dream. Abel woke before the sun, before the air turned gold, when the world was still made of fog and breath. He sat up on his cot, the wood beneath him creaking with the memory of every night that had come before. The room was thick with the smell of sweat, ashes, and the faint sweetness of tobacco that someone had hidden in a tin under the floorboards. Around him, the others stirred in silence, each man and woman carrying the same thought but never daring to speak it. Another day has come, and it's already taking something from us. Outside, the cicadas had gone quiet. That silence meant the overseer wasn't far. Abel tied the strip of cloth around his waist and stepped into the cold mud, the ground still wet from last night's rain. The cotton fields stretched ahead in ghostly rows, the plants bending under the weight of water droplets like bowed heads in prayer. He could see the gin house from here, the tall, skeletal frame of it, rising against the dawn, the wheel already turning slow and steady, as if even the machine refused to sleep. Every sound, the creak of rope, the grind of metal, felt personal. It was a language he had learned by heart, one that told him who was suffering and who was still pretending not to. Harlan Finch stood near the barn, his figure outlined against the dim light of morning. He was sharpening something, a blade maybe, or the hook used for cutting bales. The rhythm of the motion was calm, almost ritualistic. Abel watched from a distance, his jaw tightening as he saw the way Harlan's hand lingered on the steel, admiring its shine. That man's cruelty was never careless. It was artful. He didn't strike out of impulse. He struck when the silence grew too heavy, when the air itself seemed to need reminding of who it belonged to. Abel joined the others as the work bell clanged, a hollow sound that seemed to echo off the bones of the earth. The first hours always passed without thought. Hands moved faster than minds, and thoughts were dangerous anyway. He picked, sorted, carried, packed, the same motion over and over until his arms became something separate from him. Yet his eyes, they wandered. He noticed the way the clouds gathered near the horizon like smoke. He noticed the wind shifting eastward, the kind of wind that promised either a storm or a reckoning. When Ruth passed by with her basket, their eyes met briefly. She didn't smile. She never did in daylight. But there was something in her glance, something that anchored him for a moment before the overseer's shout cut through the air like a whip. "Move, Abel!" Harlan's voice cracked across the field. Abel bent down again, pretending to fumble with the cotton, but inside he felt a small, dangerous calm spreading through him. It was the same feeling he'd had as a child before doing something he knew would earn him pain, the quiet before rebellion, the strange steadiness before a storm. By midday, the sun sat high and merciless. The men worked with their heads lowered, their breath shallow. Abel's shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat. When the bell rang again for water, he didn't move. He stood for a moment too long, watching the wheel of the gin through the open barn doors. The way it turned was hypnotic, constant, consuming, and beautiful in its indifference. He thought of how many lives it had eaten, how many screams had been muffled by the rhythm of its spin. It wasn't the overseer who truly ruled this place, he realized. It was that wheel, that perfect unfeeling circle that turned everything it touched into profit or pain. When night finally crept in, Abel's body ached, but his mind refused rest. The moonlight spilled through the cracks in the cabin walls, striping the floor with silver. He could hear Ruth humming softly outside, a tune that sounded too sad to be called a song. The others were already asleep, but he stayed awake, staring at the faint outline of the gin house through the window. The wheel was still turning, even now, like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop no matter how many bodies it outlived. He thought of freedom, though he didn't know what that word meant anymore. Freedom wasn't running. It wasn't living without chains. Freedom was the sound of silence, a silence not born from fear but from choice. A silence that meant the wheel had finally stopped. He closed his eyes and saw it. The wheel shuddering, slowing, breaking apart under his hands. The image frightened him, not because it was violent, but because it was possible. In the dark, he whispered to himself words no one else could hear. "Someday," he said. Just that one word, as soft as breath. The night swallowed it whole. Outside, the cicadas began to sing again. Morning broke like glass, sharp, glittering, and already broken. The air in Charleston carried the smell of damp hay and salt from the harbor, drifting through the fields in slow waves. Abel was already awake when Harlan Finch rode in on his horse, the animal's hooves slicing through puddles left by the rain. The overseer didn't shout this time. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than any whip. Every man in the field felt it in their chest, that pause before cruelty decided where to land. Harlan dismounted and walked toward the gin, his boots leaving clean prints in the mud. His shirt was pressed, his hat tilted low, and in his hand he carried a small silver pocket watch, one he wound religiously, as if even time needed his permission to move. Abel watched from a distance, eyes lowered but not submissive. The overseer's presence worked like a contagion. People straightened, movements sharpened, breaths shortened. In a place where time belonged to someone else, every second became an act of survival. "Abel," Harlan called, not loudly, but with the sort of calm that froze the air around it. Abel stepped forward. The overseer's voice had that strange, deliberate rhythm, slow enough to sound polite, sharp enough to carry threat. "You were late to the bell yesterday. I don't tolerate lateness. You understand that, don't you?" "Yes, sir," Abel said, eyes on the ground. The words came out even, unshaken, but inside something tightened, a knot he'd learned never to loosen too early. Harlan studied him, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "You're one of the good ones, Abel. Always have been. That's why I keep you close to the gin. Not everyone can handle it. Takes discipline. Takes trust." He let that last word linger, heavy with meaning. Trust. Abel wanted to laugh. Trust was a word men like Harlan used when they wanted obedience to sound like honor. Harlan leaned closer, his breath carrying the sour edge of whiskey. "You remember that, boy. I trust you. Don't make me regret it." Then, without warning, he reached out and brushed a speck of lint off Abel's shoulder, a small, almost fatherly gesture that made Abel's stomach turn. It was the way predators touched before they struck. The overseer moved on, barking orders at others, but the residue of that moment stayed. Abel returned to his work, his body moving out of habit while his mind wandered through darker corridors. He thought of Harlan's eyes, pale blue, almost translucent, and how they never looked at him, only through him. He thought of the way those same eyes had watched his brother die 3 summers ago, caught in a machine that didn't stop fast enough. The overseer had called it an accident. Unfortunate, he'd said. But the work must go on. The wheel had turned that day too. It always did. By noon, the heat wrapped around the fields like a fever. Sweat stung Abel's eyes as he fed the cotton through the gin, his fingers careful, mechanical. He could feel the hum of the machine in his bones. Every revolution was a heartbeat. Every pull of the belt a reminder of who controlled whom. Then, faintly beneath the whirring noise, he thought he heard something else. Not a sound exactly, but a rhythm, soft and irregular, almost human. He stopped for a moment, listening. The others didn't notice. The overseer was too far away. But there it was again, like someone whispering through the gears. He told himself it was just the wind slipping through the cracks, but deep down, something in him wanted to believe the wheel was speaking. When evening fell, Harlan gathered the men by the barn. He'd found a broken lever near the gin and demanded to know who'd left it that way. No one spoke. He paced slowly, the tip of his whip dragging across the dirt, drawing a line between them all. "One of you did this," he said. "One of you thinks mistakes don't cost." His voice was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that made even the insects quiet. "If I have to ask again, I'll start taking answers from your backs." Abel's mouth opened, then closed. He hadn't done it, he knew that. But he also knew what came next if no one spoke. Before he could decide, a younger boy named Josiah stepped forward. "Sir, it was me," the boy said, trembling. He couldn't have been older than 15. Harlan nodded slowly, as if appreciating the honesty. Then, without a word, he struck him once, twice, again. The sound was dull, almost rhythmic, blending with the crickets outside. Abel looked away, but he didn't move. Because here, mercy was rebellion too. Afterward, when the night fell and the others limped back to their quarters, Harlan called out again. "Abel, stay!" Abel froze. The overseer waited until the others were gone, then walked toward him, slower now, his voice almost soft. "You think I don't see it in your eyes?" he asked, that look. "Like you're watching something I can't. You got thoughts, don't you? Dangerous ones." Abel said nothing. The air between them pulsed, thick with unspoken things. Harlan's hand lingered near the handle of his whip, then dropped away. "Get some rest," he said finally. "Long day tomorrow." As Abel walked back through the darkness, he could still hear the echo of that voice. Smooth, deliberate, soaked in venom. It wasn't the lash that haunted him most. It was the words. The way Harlan could carve obedience with language alone. He reached the quarters and found Ruth waiting outside, a candle flickering weakly in her hand. "You all right?" she asked. Her voice was hushed, heavy with caution. Abel nodded, though the truth sat heavy in his throat. "He knows," he said quietly. "Knows what?" "That I've started thinking." The candle between them trembled, the flame bending toward the wind. Ruth said nothing. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes told him what he already knew, that in this place, thought itself was rebellion. Far behind them, in the darkness of the gin house, the wheel turned on. Night in the quarters was the kind that swallowed sound. The walls seemed to breathe, wood expanding with the heat, contracting with the size of the sleeping. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of ash and boiled cornmeal, and outside, the wind pressed against the door as if trying to listen in. Abel sat near the dying fire, turning a piece of twine in his hands over and over. Across from him, Ruth stitched a tear in someone's shirt, her fingers moving with quiet precision. The needle glinted when the fire caught it, small bursts of light in the dark. They hadn't spoken since morning, but silence between them never felt empty. It was full of things they didn't dare name. He could feel her presence the way one feels the pull of the tide, constant, unseen, impossible to resist. Every time the fire cracked, he found himself looking up, waiting for her eyes to meet his. When they did, there was something in them. Not tenderness, not yet, but recognition. A kind of sorrow that had learned to hide inside grace. Ruth was older than him by a few years, though time here aged everyone differently. She carried herself like someone who had already survived too much to be surprised by cruelty. The others respected her, not because she demanded it, but because she never broke. When the lash fell, she didn't scream. When someone died, she sang, softly under her breath. Not hymns. Songs she made herself, the kind that wrapped grief in beauty so it wouldn't rot. That night, she finally spoke. "You keep looking at that gin like it's got something to say," she said, not looking up from her sewing. Her voice was calm, her words cutting through the stillness like a blade wrapped in cloth. Abel paused, the twine slipping from his hands. "Maybe it does," he said. She smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Machines don't talk, men do. And men lie." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You ever think about what'd happen if it stopped?" Her hands froze mid-stitch. The room seemed to shrink. "Stopped?" "The wheel," he said quietly. "If it stopped for good." Ruth looked at him then, truly looked, her eyes dark and sharp. "Then they'd make another one," she said. "And they'd make us turn it." He wanted to believe she was wrong, but deep down, he knew she wasn't. The system was larger than the men who ran it, larger even than the blood it spilled. Yet something inside him still burned, a small, foolish flame that refused to accept the way things were. "Maybe not this time," he murmured. Ruth set down her needle. "You talk like a man with a choice," she said softly. "That's dangerous." Her words landed heavy, not as warning but as truth. Abel turned away, watching the shadows flicker on the wall. He remembered his brother's laughter, short, bright, gone too soon. He remembered the moment the gin had taken him, the sudden scream that ended mid-breath. Ever since then, Abel had felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by the sound of the machine still turning as if nothing had happened. Ruth reached for the pot hanging near the fire and poured him a small tin of water. "You can't let the hate eat you," she said, her tone gentler now. "It'll make you see things that ain't there." Abel took the tin, his fingers brushing hers for a brief, electric second. "Maybe the things I see are real," he said. She studied him for a long time before replying. "And if they are, what then?" He didn't answer. There was no answer that wouldn't cost him something. Outside, the wind howled low, dragging through the trees like a wounded thing. Somewhere in the dark, someone coughed, someone prayed. Ruth stood, stretching her back, her shadow long and soft across the floor. "Get some rest," she said, picking up her sewing. "Morning comes early," but Abel didn't move. He sat there long after she'd gone, staring at the fire as it died down to embers. The world outside was quiet, but inside his chest something was beginning to stir. A thought that had been buried under years of labor and fear was starting to take shape. Fragile and blinding. He didn't yet know that this was how revolutions began, not with speeches or blood, but with a single question that refused to go away. By the time the fire went out, Ruth's voice drifted through the cracks in the wall, low, soft, almost a whisper. A song without words. It sounded like mourning, or maybe memory. Abel closed his eyes and listened. Every note seemed to carve a mark inside him. And though he couldn't see her, he could feel her. Close enough that her silence felt like breath on his neck. He didn't touch her that night. Didn't need to. The space between them said everything. In the dark, the cotton gin wheel turned on, miles away but still audible in his mind. And with each rotation, Abel could feel something inside him tightening, winding, waiting for the moment it would break. The night the gin spoke to him for the first time, the air was thick with thunder. Rain had not yet come, but the sky trembled as if trying to remember how. Abel stood inside the gin house, long after the others had gone to sleep, the lantern beside him flickering against the walls. The place felt alive, the floorboards breathing under his feet, the belt swaying softly in the humid air, the machine at rest but never asleep. It smelled of oil, iron, and the ghosts of sweat that would never wash out. He'd told himself he'd only come to fix the jammed lever Harlan had mentioned earlier that day, but he knew that wasn't true. He came because he couldn't stay away, because the wheel called to him the way the sea calls to a man who can't swim. Every night it spun in his dreams, slower, faster, then still, always ending with the sound of something breaking. He ran his hand along the rim of the great iron gear, feeling the ridges beneath his fingertips. The wheel was taller than him, wide as a graveyard gate, its teeth still slick with oil and cotton dust. He could see his reflection in the dark metal, a shadow of himself, warped and trembling. For a moment, he thought it was someone else looking back. When he pressed his ear against the side, he could hear it. The faintest hum, like a note held under breath. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It was something deeper, pulsing through the wood and metal. He pulled back, his heart hammering. He told himself it was his imagination. The machine didn't sing. The machine devoured. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he heard it again. A rhythm, a murmur. A song that wasn't quite a song. He whispered, "What do you want?" The silence that followed felt deliberate. The wheel did not move, but the air around it seemed to shift, tightening like muscle. Abel felt foolish speaking to it, but there was a strange comfort in it too, like confessing to something that would never tell him he was wrong. That morning, when the others arrived, he didn't mention what he'd heard. The day passed like any other, the heat pressing down, the overseer's commands falling like stones, the cotton piling higher and higher until it felt like the sky itself was made of white suffocation. But the machine's voice stayed in his head. He began to notice things, how its rhythm faltered at times, how it stuttered when certain hands fed it too quickly. It was as if the djinn had moods, tempers. Then, near dusk, it happened. A scream ripped through the room, not the high-pitched kind of surprise, but the guttural sound that tears straight out of the body. A young man named Elijah had been working near the feeder, his sleeve catching on a stray nail. Before anyone could react, the djinn took his arm. The wheel didn't stop. It spun faster. The others scrambled to pull him away, his blood painting the wood, his cries drowning beneath the sound of machinery. Abel froze. He knew that sound, not just the scream but the wheel's roar. It was joy, hunger, completion. When it was finally over, when the machine fell still and the air filled with the metallic tang of blood, Abel stood there shaking. Harlan arrived moments later, his boots echoing through the silence. He barely glanced at the body before barking orders to clean the mess. "Get him out," he said, voice steady as stone. "We can't afford to waste a night." Abel stared at him. Something inside snapped, not loud, not visible, but real. "You don't stop for nothing," Abel whispered under his breath. Harlan turned. "What was that?" "Nothing, sir, but it wasn't nothing. It was everything. It was a seed buried deep in the wet soil of his soul, already beginning to sprout." That night, he washed Elijah's blood from his hands in the river, the water running dark around his fingers. Ruth found him there, her face pale in the moonlight. "They said you were with him," she whispered. "I was." She knelt beside him. "Was it quick?" He wanted to lie. He wanted to tell her the boy hadn't suffered. But he couldn't. "No," he said finally. The machine didn't let him go easy. Ruth's eyes glistened, catching the faint silver of the moon. "They never do," she murmured. Abel stared out at the current. He was just a boy. All he wanted was to live long enough to see the sea. Ruth reached for his wrist. "Don't go near that djinn again tonight," she said. "Please." But even as she said it, they both knew he would. When he returned later, the djinn stood still, dark, massive, waiting. The rain had started at last, soft at first, then harder, hammering the roof in uneven beats. Abel walked up to the wheel and pressed his hand against it again. The metal was cold, trembling faintly beneath the storm's weight, and then he heard it. Faint, almost kind. A whisper threading through the thunder. "Stop me!" He pulled back, heart in his throat. For a long moment he stood there, listening. The words didn't repeat, but their echo did, slipping under his skin like fever. He turned away, his pulse thundering in his ears, and for the first time, he understood. The machine was alive. And worse, it had learned to speak in the voice of his own thoughts. Outside, the rain poured harder, washing blood and soil together into the earth. Inside, Abel whispered to the dark, "Someday soon." The wheel, silent now, seemed to shiver, as if it had heard him. By the time autumn crept into Charleston, the air itself felt starved. The cicadas had gone silent. The trees shed their leaves too early, as though they too were trying to leave this earth before the season turned cruel again. The harvest was late, the cotton thin, and the overseer's temper sharper than ever. Harlan's voice became the whip long before the whip itself ever cracked. He was the kind of man who had learned to smile only when someone else was in pain, a grin stretched over a wound that never healed. At the start of the week, he gathered everyone by the big house and read aloud a list of offenses: missing cotton bales, damaged tools, a broken cartwheel. None of them had done these things, not really. But guilt was the soil he liked to till, soft, rich, easy to plant fear in. Abel stood at the back, hands clasped, eyes down. He didn't look up when Harlan's boots scraped against the steps. He didn't flinch when the whip cracked against the air beside him. But when it fell on Elijah's empty place, that little space between two men who had worked side by side for years, he felt the world tip slightly. The space where a boy should have stood now existed only as a bruise in the air. "Y'all listen," Harlan said, pacing slowly. "A machine don't stop for no man. A hand don't get caught unless it's lazy. I'll have no more laziness here." His words rolled like thunder. "Work harder, and you live longer." The laughter that followed from the house, the faint, drunken drawl of white men watching from the balcony, scraped at Abel's nerves. They were having a feast that night, the kind they held whenever the harvest was good, even if it came from the backs of those who bled for it. The smell of roasted meat drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the stench of sweat and oil. Abel's stomach turned. As darkness fell, music began to rise from the house. A fiddle's sharp cry, a banjo's trembling rhythm, the clatter of glass and laughter. The workers were sent back to the quarters, but Abel lingered near the edge of the field, staring at the light spilling from the windows. He could see Harlan inside, raising a glass, his voice booming louder than the others. Every movement of that man had the arrogance of someone who believed the world itself was his birthright. Abel felt something inside him tighten. Not rage exactly, but something colder, steadier. A calm that didn't belong to him. He turned his gaze toward the gin house in the distance. It stood in silhouette against the dim horizon, its wheel glinting like an eye-catching firelight. The thought struck him, the kind of thought that feels like it comes from outside oneself. What if he met the wheel? He shook his head, trying to chase it away. But it stayed. The night deepened. The feast grew louder. He could hear fragments of songs drifting through the humid air, twisted by laughter. Somewhere, a woman's cry of mock joy cut through, one of the house slaves, forced to dance for them. Abel clenched his fists. He turned away from the lights and started walking toward the gin. The air grew cooler as he approached, the smell of rain still clinging to the ground. The gin door creaked open with a sigh and he stepped inside. The lantern still hung where he'd left it, a weak flame fluttering against the dark. The machine loomed before him, silent and massive, its metal slick with condensation. He reached out, tracing the curve of the wheel. "Stop me," he whispered. The words came again, faint, echoing from the hollow of his skull. Only now, they weren't the machine's. They were his own. He imagined Harlan's hand on the lever, his smug voice barking orders, his laughter mixing with the sound of grinding gears. The image was too clear, too vivid. He stepped back, trembling. "No," he muttered. Not yet, but he couldn't leave. The gin seemed to breathe with him, its shadows shifting. He could almost see Elijah's face in the streaks of oil, the boy's wide, terrified eyes staring through him. "You gonna let it happen again?" the voice in his mind asked. He pressed his palms against his ears, trying to shut it out. But the hum began, that low, vibrating song that only he could hear. It filled his bones, his chest, his breath. Then the door opened. "Abel?" Ruth's voice. He turned sharply. She stood in the doorway, the lantern light catching the edge of her face, half fear, half fury. "What you doing in here?" she demanded. He said nothing. "You can't stay near that thing after dark." "You know what it does." He looked past her toward the lights of the big house. "He's in there," he said softly. "Eating, laughing." Her eyes followed his. "And you think you can change that?" He didn't answer. "Abel," she said again, stepping closer, "don't you bring that curse on yourself. Machines don't forgive. Men like him don't die easy. You'll just be another story they tell to scare children." Her words hit him, but he barely heard them. The wheel behind him gleamed faintly in the dark, as if smiling. Ruth grabbed his arm. "Promise me you won't do nothing foolish." He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw what he'd been hiding. Not just hatred, but clarity. "I won't do nothing foolish," he said finally. "But I'll do what's right." Outside, thunder rolled again, far off but coming closer. Ruth turned away, shaking her head. She knew he meant it. When she was gone, Abel faced the wheel one last time. "Not yet," he said, almost a prayer. "But soon." The ginn's silence was answer enough. That night, while Harlan feasted, the machine slept, but not peacefully. In its dreams, metal teeth ground against bone, and a song began to form, slow, deliberate, waiting for the moment it would finally be sung. By dawn, the storm had passed, but it left the air thick and electric, as though the sky itself still remembered the violence. The fields were soaked, the cotton heavy with rain, bending like bowed heads. Abel rose before the horn sounded, his body moving through the motions it had known since childhood, but his mind elsewhere, back at the gin, back at the wheel that had whispered his name. He couldn't stop hearing it, that faint vibration beneath the skin of silence. The machine was alive in him now, not as metal or gear, but as purpose. Every hum of wind through the fields, every thud of the overseer's boots felt like a countdown. When Harlan appeared, the world seemed to tighten around him. His boots sank slightly into the mud, but he walked like a man certain the earth itself was obliged to hold him up. His eyes scanned the rows with lazy cruelty, pausing on faces just long enough to make them drop their gaze. "Work clean," he barked. "We got a quota to make up from that boy's little accident." That word, accident, slipped through Abel like a blade. Elijah's death had been folded into business, turned into arithmetic. A boy's life reduced to a gap in production. By midday, the heat returned. Steam rose from the damp ground and the smell of sweat and metal filled the air. Abel's hands moved automatically, plucking, twisting, gathering. Around him, the others worked in a rhythm too old to break, a rhythm of endurance. Ruth was in the next row, her shoulders trembling with exhaustion. Every so often their eyes met, and in that silent glance, whole conversations passed. Warnings, memories, fear. But fear could only hold back so much. That afternoon, the overseer's whip cracked again. This time it wasn't for punishment, not exactly. It was for control, to remind everyone that even the air belonged to him. He called over a man named Jonas, accused him of hiding cotton, of trying to cheat the weight. Jonas protested, soft, trembling words that no one dared echo. Harlan struck him anyway, once, twice. The sound of it splintered the day. Abel froze. Something inside him snapped, not loudly, not visibly, but deep, quiet, final. He looked toward the gin house in the distance, the sun glinting off its roof. The hum inside him rose again, faint but insistent, like a song waiting to be answered. That night, when the work ended, he didn't go to the quarters. He went back to the gin. The air was thick with the scent of oil and rain-soaked dust. The machine stood there in silence, massive and patient. The wheel gleamed faintly under the lantern light. Abel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small nail he'd taken from the tool shed, nothing more than a sliver of rusted iron, but it caught the light like something sacred. He turned it between his fingers, thinking. He could see it clearly now, not in his imagination, but in the future. The overseer stumbling into this place, the scream that would follow, the sound of the machine swallowing him whole. But there was something else beneath that image. guilt. Abel knelt beside the wheel, his hands trembling. He whispered, "If I do this, if I turn it for him, am I different from him?" The machine said nothing, but the silence was heavier than words. It seemed to press on him, to test him. From outside came a sound, footsteps, steady and slow. Abel stiffened. He doused the lantern and stepped back into shadow. The door creaked open. A beam of light cut across the floor. It was Harlan. He carried a bottle in one hand and a pistol in the other, his face red with drink, his eyes small and glinting. "You here?" he called out. "Thought I saw someone moving." Abel didn't move. He could smell the liquor on him even from the dark. Harlan stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He kicked at the gears idly, sneering. "Useless thing. Broke more hands than it fixed. But it keeps y'all working, don't it?" He turned and saw Abel. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them pulsed. "What you doing here?" Harlan demanded, his voice slurring but hard. "Checking the machine," Abel said quietly. "At this hour?" He laughed, a coarse sound that echoed off the metal. "Don't lie to me, boy." Abel's hands curled into fists. His throat was dry. Harlan stepped closer. "You think I don't see that look? You think I don't know what you want? You want revenge for that boy, don't you?" The word revenge hung in the air like smoke. Abel didn't answer. Harlan raised the pistol, tapping it against his palm. "You forget your place, and that machine won't be the only thing turning tonight." The words barely finished before something inside Abel broke loose. He lunged. The bottle shattered. The pistol clattered. The two men collided against the ginn's frame, the sound of their struggle mixing with the soft, rising hum of the machine. Metal ground against wood. Gears began to shift. The wheel, dormant for days, started to move. Slow, deliberate, like it had been waiting. Abel barely heard his own breath as Harlan's hand struck his face. The world tilted, then stilled. The wheel still turning, the air vibrating with its rhythm. He saw Harlan's arm reach for the lever, and in that moment, Abel's decision was no longer his own. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted, and pushed. The lever slammed down. The machine roared. There was a scream. Brief. Inhuman. Cut off by the grinding of gears. Then silence. Abel stood there, trembling, the hum fading into nothing. He stared at what was left, the smear of red across the cotton, the glint of the wheel still turning as though it hadn't noticed what it had done. He sank to his knees. His breath came in broken gasps. He whispered to no one, "You asked me to stop you." The machine stood still again, its hunger sated. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the kind that waits, patient, watchful, because it knows that the price of justice is never paid in full. The next morning came as if the world had forgotten what it had done. The sky was clean, the air still, the dawn soft as breath. But beneath that fragile light, everything was wrong. The birds were quiet. The field hands didn't hum their usual songs. The overseer's voice, that voice that ruled every corner of their days, was gone. When Ruth awoke, she felt it before she knew it. The quiet had weight. She stepped outside and saw men gathered near the edge of the gin house, their bodies forming a tight, trembling circle. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She walked slowly, her hands shaking. When she reached the doorway, she stopped. The smell hit first: iron, oil, something raw and irreversible. Then she saw it. The wheel stood still, its teeth blackened with blood, a single strip of cloth caught in its gears. The overseer's hat lay in the dirt, half crushed. His body, or what was left of it, had already been taken away. No one spoke. They just stared, waiting for someone to tell them what to feel. Abel was there, standing apart from the others. His face was unreadable, but his hands were clean, too clean. Ruth's eyes met his, and in that look, everything passed between them. Understanding, fear, condemnation, and something else. Relief. "Accident," someone whispered. The word moved through the group like a breeze through dry grass. "The machine took him. Just like it took the boy," another said. No one dared say more. By midday, the master's men came from the big house. They asked questions. How long had the overseer been missing, who last saw him, whether the djinn had been malfunctioning? The answers came slow, cautious. No one mentioned Abel. No one mentioned the sound they'd heard before dawn. A single, strangled cry swallowed by thunder. The men examined the machine, muttered about safety, cursed the damn contraption. Then they ordered it shut down until further notice. The wheel stopped turning. The air grew heavier. That night, the quarters were silent. No laughter. No stories. The kind of silence that presses against the walls, daring someone to break it. Ruth sat outside her door, staring at the dark line of the djinn house in the distance. It looked different now, smaller, almost human in its stillness. Abel sat beside her, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on nothing. "You did it," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer. "You think I don't see it? You think I don't know what that look means? You went in there knowing what would happen." Abel's jaw tightened. He wasn't supposed to touch the lever. "That don't matter," she said. "You knew it would come to this." He turned toward her, his face hollowed by the moonlight. "He killed Elijah," he said quietly. "And he would have done worse. Every day, every breath he took was a curse on the rest of us. You think God was going to stop him? I did what the world wouldn't." Ruth looked away, her eyes filling. "And what did it cost you?" He didn't answer. In the distance, thunder rolled again, though the sky was clear. The sound lingered, deep and low, like the echo of the wheel still spinning somewhere beyond sight. Later, when everyone else had gone inside, Abel walked back toward the djinn house. The door hung open slightly, creaking with each breath of wind. He stepped inside, lantern in hand. The smell was weaker now, but the stain remained, dark, sticky, unmoving. He crouched beside it, touched the floor. It was cold. He whispered, "It's done." The silence answered him with a sound that wasn't a sound, a faint hum, like breath caught in the machine's chest. He froze, his eyes lifting to the wheel. It moved, just once. A slow, trembling shudder, Abel stepped back, heart pounding. The lever hadn't been touched. The air was still. But the wheel, it had turned. He left the lantern behind as he ran out into the night. The fields stretched before him, endless and pale. The cotton glowed faintly in the moonlight, every stalk like a ghost rising from the ground. He stopped only when he reached the edge of the swamp. The smell of decay, of earth and memory, rose up around him. He dropped to his knees and buried his face in his hands. It should have been over. The man was dead. The machine was silent. But inside him, the wheel still spun, slow, merciless, whispering the same word over and over again. Justice. He looked toward the dark water, the reflection of the moon rippling like a wound. "Is that what this is?" he whispered. "Justice?" The swamp didn't answer. Behind him, the wind shifted. From the fields came the faintest creak of metal, too far to be real, too soft to be ignored. The wheel was still turning, somewhere deep inside the night. Days passed, though none could tell how many. Time no longer moved the way it once did. It stretched and folded over itself like a breath held too long. The plantation carried on in its strange rhythm, pretending not to notice that the air had changed, that something unseen now watched over every field, every rusted nail, every creak of the cotton gin. The new overseer arrived before the week was out. He was younger, quieter, a man who seemed to mistake politeness for mercy. His name was Mr. Burke. He wore clean clothes and spoke in measured tones, but when he looked at the workers, his eyes carried the same distance, that invisible wall built from ownership. "Let's keep things peaceful," he said on his first morning, the words falling flat in the heavy air. "We'll start fresh, but there is no such thing as fresh on cursed soil. Every step leaves a print that never fades." Abel kept to himself. He worked harder than before, his face an empty mask. He spoke little, slept less. Ruth watched him from afar, wanting to reach him, afraid to try. Every night she heard him stir, footsteps outside, the faint rustle of his breath. Sometimes she found him near the gin house again, standing before the door like a man visiting a grave he could not stop returning to. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Mr. Burke approached Abel while he worked. "You were close with the old overseer, weren't you?" he asked, his tone too casual. Abel froze. "Close?" Burke smiled slightly. "You worked under him longer than most. Must have learned his ways." Abel's hands tightened around the bundle of cotton. "I learned what not to be." Burke studied him, that faint, probing curiosity in his eyes. "Strange thing the way he died. Machines don't often start themselves." Abel said nothing. "You hear it, don't you?" Burke continued. "That sound it makes when you're near, like it's breathing." The words landed like stones. Abel turned, his expression unreadable. "You been near it?" Burke nodded. "Walked past it last night. Thought I heard something moving. But when I opened the door, nothing. Just the smell of oil." The silence between them stretched. Abel could feel the man's gaze pressing against him, testing for cracks. That night, Abel didn't sleep. He sat outside, staring at the sky, at the faint shimmer of stars barely visible through the haze. His hands trembled. The thought of the gin stirring again, of someone else hearing what he'd heard, made the air feel thin. He rose before dawn and went back to the building. Inside it was dark, the smell of rust and damp wood filling the air. The wheel stood still. The lever hung at rest. But the silence was too loud, the kind that carries memory in its echo. Abel stepped closer, touching the frame. "I'm not coming back," he whispered. "You understand?" "It's over." For a long moment, nothing. Then, a faint creak. Abel stepped back. The wheel shifted just slightly, enough to catch the lantern light. He could see it then, faint and red-brown, the dried stain along the rim. The blood that no one could scrub away. He turned and left, walking fast, his heart hammering. The wind followed him, carrying the whisper of something not done. In the days that followed, small things began to happen. A cart broke without reason. A blade jammed and sliced through a man's hand. The horses startled at nothing. One night, the cotton caught fire. A quick, hungry flame that vanished as suddenly as it came. The next morning, the smell of ash lingered over everything. People began to talk. "Machine cursed," they said. "Took what it wanted and ain't finished." Ruth heard them whispering and felt the chill move through her bones. She found Abel sitting alone near the fence line, his eyes distant, hollowed out. "You have to leave," she said. "Go north. Go anywhere but here." He didn't look up. "You think I can outrun it?" "You can try." Abel shook his head. "It don't live in the ground. It's in me now. Every time I close my eyes, I see it turning. Slow, waiting." Ruth's voice broke. "Then what do you want? To stay and let it take you too?" Abel finally looked at her. His face was calm, too calm. "Maybe that's what it wants. Maybe that's what I owe." She stepped forward, tears trembling in her eyes. "You don't owe it anything," he smiled faintly. "That's where you're wrong. The wheel don't stop till it's even. That's the law of this land." That night he went to the gin again. Ruth followed, though she didn't mean to. Something in her told her it would be the last time. He stood in front of the door, the lantern trembling in his hand. "You ever wonder," he said softly, "if a machine can have a soul? If it can remember what it's done?" Ruth didn't answer. "I think it remembers," Abel said. "And I think it don't forget who fed it." He opened the door. The darkness inside seemed deeper than before, swallowing the lantern light. The wheel waited. The stains gleamed faintly. Ruth reached out for him, but he stepped inside. "Abel," she whispered. He turned to her, and for the briefest second, she saw something almost peaceful in his eyes. "I set it in motion," he said. "Now I'll stop it myself." The door closed behind him. There was silence. Then, the faintest hum, low and steady, like breath drawn for the last time. When Ruth pushed the door open moments later, the lantern had gone out. The wheel had stopped. Completely. And Abel was gone. Only the sound of the wind remained, threading through the boards like a sigh. Outside, The sky began to pale, a thin line of light bleeding into the horizon. The fields shimmered faintly under it, every stalk of cotton glowing red at the edges, as though the earth itself was remembering what it had taken. Morning came hollow. The fields looked the same, but they carried an ache, a strange stillness that no wind could stir. Word spread quickly through the quarters. Abel was gone. Some said he'd run off toward the swamps. Some said he'd been taken. But those who had heard the faint hum before dawn, that slow, sorrowful groan from the gin house, knew better. They didn't speak it aloud, but their eyes said everything. The machine had claimed its final debt. Ruth sat by the door of her cabin long after the others had gone to work. Her hands were folded, but they would not stay still. She kept glancing toward the gin house at the edge of the field, its roof black against the brightening sky. The door hung open now, swaying in the wind, the sound soft and rhythmic, almost like breathing. When night fell again, she went to it. She couldn't help herself. The need to see, to know, had grown unbearable. The path was damp, the grass whispering under her feet. The air carried that familiar scent, iron, oil, rain, the same scent that marked every turning point in her life. Inside, the darkness felt alive. The lanterns had long burned out. The wheel was still. The air was heavy with something that wasn't quite silence, not quite sound. Ruth stepped closer. Her breath came short. She called his name once, twice. No answer. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw the mark, a handprint. Faint, the color of rust pressed against the wooden frame beside the lever. It was too small to be Harlan's, too fresh to be old. Her knees weakened. She pressed her own hand against it, and for a moment she could almost feel warmth beneath the wood, a pulse that didn't belong there. Behind her, the wind shifted. The wheel moved just once. She stumbled back, covering her mouth. The sound was soft, like a sigh escaping from a tired body. Then came another, faint, measured, almost like footsteps retreating into the dark. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. "Abel?" she whispered. Nothing. The machine stood still again. She turned to leave, but the door wouldn't move. The latch had jammed, swollen with moisture, refusing to open. Her pulse quickened. She forced it, nails digging into the wood, whispering to herself to stay calm. When it finally gave, she stumbled outside, gasping. The night air rushed in like mercy, behind her. The gin house creaked once, then fell silent forever. The next morning, they found it collapsed. The roof caved in as though the earth had decided to bury what it could no longer bear. The master's men cursed the storm that never was, blaming rot, time, and the carelessness of slaves. But those who worked the field said nothing. They knew storms didn't need clouds to break something open. For days after, no one went near the ruins. The cotton grew wild around it, unpicked and untamed, the plants spreading like white fire. At night, from the quarters, some swore they could see light flickering among the wreckage. Not flames. Not lanterns, but something gentler, as if the land itself was remembering a man's last stand. Ruth stopped speaking of it. She carried on her days like everyone else, but her nights belonged to silence. Sometimes she thought she heard him, that low hum, the one that had haunted Abel, now pulsing faintly at the edge of her hearing. It came when the wind was still, when the world seemed too quiet to be empty. One evening, she went to the edge of the field where the ruins lay hidden beneath weeds. She sat there until the sun sank and the sky bled purple. She spoke softly, not to the air, not to God, but to the earth itself. "They'll forget you," she said. "They'll tell it wrong. They'll say the machine took him, not that he chose to go. But I'll remember. I'll tell it the way it happened. Not with fear, but with truth." She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. A nail, rusted and bent, the kind the men used to fix the gin's boards. She turned it in her hand, the metal warm from her skin, then pressed it into the soil. "For every hand that turned that wheel," she whispered, "may the land finally rest." The wind rose, soft but sure, brushing against her face. The fields moved in unison, cotton heads swaying like a tide. Somewhere in that sound, faint and far, came the whisper she'd been waiting for. "It's over." Tears slid down her cheeks. She closed her eyes. For the first time in months, the air felt clean. Years would pass. The plantation would fall, its name lost to history, its fields turned to shadow. People would build new things over it, roads, houses, gardens, never knowing what slept beneath their feet. But on quiet nights when the wind crossed from the river, there would still come a sound. A low, steady hum, the song of a wheel that once knew the taste of justice and never forgot the man who gave it peace. And sometimes, if you listened closely, you could almost hear a voice beneath it. Not angry, not mournful, just tired. A voice whispering from the soil of Charleston, where blood and cotton met and learned to be still. The voice said only one word: free.